Okay, well, I don't want to take away from any time we have for this discussion, so I am just going to jump right in. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. The New England Law Review and I are so incredibly excited for today. So on behalf of the Law Review and the School Center for Business Law, I'd like to welcome our featured author, Professor Nancy Leong. I'm going to keep this brief because this is an incredibly important discussion that deserves all the time we can provide it. My name is Kyle Sutton. I am the editor-in-chief of Volume 56 of the New England Law Review, and we are bringing today's conversation, which will explore Professor Leong's book, Identity Capitalists, The Powerful Insiders Who Exploit Diversity to Maintain Inequality, to New England Law, Boston. And this is something we are incredibly proud and excited to be a part of. Professor Leong's book coins the term identity capitalists to label the powerful insiders who gain social and economic value from outgroups. Her work arms readers with the tools to recognize and mitigate the harms of such exploitation and looks to what happens when we prioritize diversity over equality. We cannot thank Professor Leong enough for sharing her time and work with us, and a huge thank you to the panelists for joining. Thank you for sharing your insight, perspective, expertise, and experience. We are so grateful to get to learn from and with you today. The response pieces that were written by the panel that will be discussed today are going to be featured in volume 56-2 of our journal that will be published in the coming months. In order to have a more engaging event and promote participation, I would ask everyone at this time if you could turn on your cameras so we can capture that feel of a live symposium. We would be so appreciative. If you have your camera on and you answer the trivia question that will be posted in a little bit in a poll, you have a chance to win a signed copy of Professor Leong's book. Lastly, I would like to thank Professor Veriani for everything that she has done to make this discussion possible and for graciously agreeing to moderate today. So I will hand the mic over to Professor Veriani now to let her introduce herself and the panel.
Thanks so much, Kyle. I know Professor Leong feels the same way that I do, but your putting together of this panel has been, you've been tireless, and all of what you have done has been seamless. And for such an important discussion, the respect and care that you've put into this really shows. And so we're really grateful to you and the entire staff of the New England Law Review for this. So I am, for those of you who don't know me, I think many of you do. My name is Natasha Veriani. I am an associate professor here at New England Law, Boston. I am so pleased today to be able to moderate this discussion and have been so honored to respond to Professor Leong's book. Professor Leong is the William M. Beanie Memorial Research Chair and Professor of Law at the University of Denver Strum College of Law. And so we're really grateful to have her here today, and author of the book, and many, many other pieces of scholarship that I've had the great pleasure of getting to know while preparing for this symposium. So thank you, Professor Leong, for your work and your insights. I also want to introduce Professor Nicole Porter, who is a distinguished university professor and professor of law at the University of Toledo College of Law. And we're very happy to have you here. I really enjoyed your response piece too. And also to welcome my another friend and colleague, Professor Ellen Farwell, who is a faculty fellow here at New England Law, Boston, who will be talking a bit about her response piece to identity capitalists. So the format of this discussion is that I'm going to finish up speaking as quickly as I can with the introduction, because we'll turn this over to Professor Leong to describe a bit about her work and provide an explanation or any additional insights about the book. And then after that, we will hear both from Professor Porter and Professor Farwell about their response pieces very briefly before, and then we'll take a short break after that. And we'll come back to open up a discussion, which for me is sort of the main event with this, because I'm really interested in hearing so much about how everybody relates to this piece. It's a very particular piece of legal scholarship that is so important and so compelling because of the way that it connects to people. So I'm really looking forward to moderating a discussion about this piece. And that was what we will do for the bulk of the second hour of this program, before turning to Professor Lustig from the Center for Business Law for some closing remarks, and then back to Kyle to close the event on behalf of the New England Law Review. So I'm really happy to be here today. And I will say before turning this over to Professor Leong that as someone who teaches in the areas of property and critical race theory and has existed in a lot of different spaces, feeling like in other, this piece was particularly compelling to me, both sort of on a very professional level, but also on a really visceral personal level. And so what I wrote about in my piece was something about our value and our values. I really like the way that that word can be used in some different contexts. And I think Professor Leong has been so insightful about sort of the way that we value parts of our identities, and that's reflective of sort of our collective values that we have for what's important and how we organize ourselves and think about justice and equity and what's fair. So I'm really interested in that. I know that during moderation, I will have trouble not keeping my responses short. So I am going to now turn it over to Professor Leong to give a bit of an overview and some additional insights about her book, but all with warmth and gratitude. And before I turn it over to Professor Leong, I'm sorry, I want to just remember that we have, that this is a discussion that I encourage you to bring your grace to this discussion, to bring your bravery. Sometimes it is difficult to talk about some of these issues. They are very personal. And so when others do speak in that way, I hope that we will all, I want to sort of establish a baseline of respect and professionalism when we gather and find a way to talk about these issues. So I'm really excited to hear from Professor Leong, and I will turn it over to her now. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor Variani, for that lovely introduction. Excuse me, for that lovely introduction. And it's just so great to be here today. I want to extend my thanks to the whole New England Law Review staff, especially Kyle Sutton, for organizing such a fabulous event. And in addition to Professor Variani, also to Professor Porter, Professor Farwell, and Professor Lustig for being here today, and to all of you for being here and to giving me the opportunity for discussion and engagement in relation to my book, Identity Capitalists. As both Kyle and Professor Variani have already touched on, this does tend to be a book that people relate to on a personal level, as well as what we might call an intellectual or an academic level. And so I'm really excited to hear what you all take from the discussion and the book, if you've had a chance to read it or skim it, in addition to what we all might think about or talk about maybe in a more scholarly discourse. So what I'm interested in doing in this book and in my research more generally is looking at and thinking about how we as a society value identity. And specifically, I look at the way that in-groups, meaning groups that are powerful or dominant in a particular context. So in many instances in the United States today, that means white people, men, straight people, wealthy people, non-disabled people. Those are what I describe as in-groups in my book. And so what I'm looking at is how these in-groups benefit from out-group identity. Out-group identity meaning folks who are not men, people of color, people who are not straight, people who are not wealthy, and so forth. And I thought that I would start today with a few specific examples. And I do have just a few PowerPoint slides. I'm not interested in putting a PowerPoint in your face for the next half hour. But identity capitalism, or what I mean by identity capitalism, is often kind of a visual thing. And so I thought that we could start out with just a few slides today. So here's my book. And building on this concept of in-groups and out-groups, I'd like everybody to take a look at these two photos. So these two photos are similar, but they are not identical. The photo on the left is the original photo. The photo on the right is the photo as it appeared on the cover of the University of Wisconsin's admissions brochure in 2001. And as you can see, if you look behind the right shoulder of the woman in the white sweatshirt in the foreground of the photo with her arm upraised, you can see behind her shoulder that there has been an addition. Specifically, the University of Wisconsin has photoshopped a Black person onto the cover of their undergraduate admissions brochure. And so in this example, the University of Wisconsin is acting as what I would call an identity capitalist. An identity capitalist is a person or an institution, here a predominantly white institution, so an in-group institution, that is using an out-group member in some way to benefit itself. And so in this situation, the University of Wisconsin is using the image of this Black person who actually was a student at the school at the time. His name was Diallo Shabazz. They're using the image or the likeness of this Black student to benefit themselves in a number of ways. One way, perhaps, is by making the campus appear more diverse. So at the time this admissions brochure appeared, the University of Wisconsin had only 3% Black students in its student body. This would have other benefits as well for the University of Wisconsin, in addition to signaling that it was actually more racially diverse than it was. One is that it would potentially attract other students of color or just other students who care about attending a racially diverse institution. It also makes the university look more appealing to other stakeholders, to parents, to the community, to donors, to trustees, whoever might care about racial diversity at the University of Wisconsin. And I picked the University of Wisconsin, but I'm not picking on the University of Wisconsin. Racial photoshopping is actually very common in higher education. I learned as I was researching this book. Here's another example. So if you glance quickly at this photo that comes from the promotional materials for one of the University of Texas's campus, well, if you glance quickly, you see, 4 happy, smiling, racially diverse friends. If you start to look a little bit more closely, you can see that the Black woman on the right side of the photograph is not standing in the same light as the other 3 people in the photo. Also, if you look along the side of her head, you can see some white dots. That's where she was photoshopped against the brick wall that she's standing against. So when you look a little more closely, this is perhaps a pretty obvious Photoshop job. Let me give you just a couple of other examples. Here's some text and images drawn from the Walmart website. And again, I picked Walmart, but this could really be any company. Every big company and most small and medium-sized companies have some language and photos like this. So Walmart and other companies, again, are predominantly white institutions that are run by white people, by predominantly men, by predominantly people who are wealthy and straight and other identity categories, showcasing their diversity in a way that benefits themselves. It enhances the institutional reputation. And they're using the identities of outgroup members here, women, people of color, and so forth, to portray themselves as a diverse and inclusive company, the kind of place where you might want to work or to shop. And notice that all of this in the long run is making Walmart money. Walmart is benefiting economically here. That's part of what makes Walmart an identity capitalist, in addition to a literal capitalist, but that's a whole other talk and book. I also want to note that Walmart has been sued many times by members of the identity groups that it presents visually on its website. And so there's an element of damage control here as well. There's a way in which Walmart is benefiting itself by using these images. The third example, some of you may remember from the 2016 presidential campaign. At one of Donald Trump's rallies, he pointed at a Black man in the crowd and said, look at my African American over here. That's a quote. Look at my African American over here. The Black man, Greg Chadle, was actually not a Donald Trump supporter. He went to the rally because he was interested in seeing what it was like, and later said that it was surreal to hear Donald Trump call him out. In this situation, Donald Trump is an identity capitalist, maybe the consummate or paradigmatic identity capitalist, a straight, white, wealthy, not visibly disabled man who is using a Black person to communicate that members of that identity group support him, or at the very least that not every member of that identity group dislikes him. Now, this is to counter accusations that his campaign was racist, and later accusations that his administration, after he was elected, was white supremacist. And we see Donald Trump go on to do this with a number of other Black people in his administration, ranging from Clarence Thomas to Ben Carson to some of you may remember Omarosa's brief stint in the White House, to Diamond and Silk, who we could maybe charitably call political commentators. If you're not familiar with Diamond and Silk, maybe give them a Google after this talk. And we could laugh or roll our eyes at this and just say, well, Donald Trump, he's over the top. But I suspect that many of you have actually heard someone you know, maybe even a parent or a close friend, say something like this, that I can't be racist because I have a friend who is Black or Asian American or Native American, whatever the identity category at issue is, or that I can't be homophobic because I have a gay friend or my sister is gay or something like that. This phenomenon is actually documented empirically. Research has found that white people tend to exaggerate both the number and the closeness of their friends of color, sometimes by a factor of as much as 7 relative to the people of color in the same comparison group. Okay, so where is all of this coming from? So let me, just to make this a little more interactive, perhaps, let me stop screen sharing for a little bit. In my book, I argue that the impetus for identity capitalism is coming in part, not entirely, but in part from Supreme Court decisions relating to diversity, and that there is a thread of similarity that runs through all of these examples and many others that I talk about in the book that is in part emanating from Supreme Court jurisprudence related to the concept of diversity. For the past 40 years, diversity has been the only rationale that the Supreme Court has accepted to justify a race-based affirmative action program in higher education admissions, except for the narrow carve-out for correcting past discrimination by a particular institution. We'll set that to the side for the time being because it's very narrow and not very frequently used. One thing that this reliance on diversity as a rationale does is it puts a lot of emphasis on displaying diversity, sometimes visually displaying diversity, sometimes verbally attesting to diversity, but it really becomes a high stakes endeavor to put on display or to showcase the diversity in particular institutions or the diversity that a particular individual is affiliated with in various aspects of their life. And I think that many people have certainly bought into diversity in the sense that they agree that there is value to be had by, for example, having people of color around, or having gender diverse people around, or people with disabilities, in particular people with visible disabilities around. And I certainly, and I want this to be really clear in my talk, I certainly cannot fault colleges and universities for going down this road because it's the only road the Supreme Court has left open. There's no other choice if a school wants to have a race-based affirmative action program. But I think that the way that this is implemented sometimes leaves some concerns and some rooms for improvement. And what I argue in the book is that this emphasis on the appearance of diversity gives institutions a motive to affiliate with members of out groups. groups, with people of color, with non-men, for lack of a better term. So a motive to affiliate with members of out-groups, but not necessarily a motive to do anything more meaningful, to make the institution or the environment a better one for members of those out-groups. And this is actually a criticism that many legal scholars have raised in relation to the diversity rationale. So Professor Veriani mentioned her critical race theory teaching at the beginning of this lecture. Perhaps some of you, through critical race theory studies in that class or in other classes, may be familiar with Derek Bell's incredibly important work. Derek Bell, of course, is one of the founders of critical race theory. And I recommend to you an essay that he wrote in 2003, shortly after the University of Michigan affirmative action decisions. And the title of this essay, which was published as part of a symposium in the Columbia Law Review, is called Diversity's Distractions. Diversity's Distractions. And his argument is not that diversity is bad, but rather that diversity sometimes can be a distraction from a more meaningful examination of inequality within institutions, the historical reasons for inequality within institutions, and what can be done about inequality within institutions. Now, just to be clear, like Professor Bell, I am not against diversity. I think that diversity is so important, and I am so glad whenever I see that an institution or an organization is meaningfully diverse. But with that said, diversity, I believe, and I argue in my book, can't be the only goal or the end goal. Diversity, I would say, is a means to an end, not the end in itself. To understand the difference between diversity and more meaningful substantive reforms, let me just go back to the PowerPoint for a moment and provide you with another example. So consider two law schools. The first law school graduates 100 students every year, of whom 95 are white and 5 are not. I'm not going to read the PowerPoint out loud to you, but so at this law school, the students of color, the small number of students of color are not doing well. They're not getting good grades. They feel isolated. They're not passing the bar at the same rates. They're not receiving the same job opportunities upon graduation. Even though the students of color are struggling, Law School Number One on its website and in its other promotional materials highlights the students of color, and we could even say showcases them or puts them on display. Contrast Law School Number One with Law School Number Two. Unlike Law School Number One, Law School Number Two is meaningfully diverse from a race perspective. So 40% of the school is students of color. That is a significant number of students of color, more than at most law schools in the country. But the students of color are having all the same problems, struggling with grades, struggling with feelings of isolation and other mental health challenges. Again, even so, Law School Number Two is showing off its students of color on the website and in its other promotional materials. And so this simple and I'm going to say relatively stylized example is designed to show that numerical diversity is not, even if it's not quite a distraction per Derek Bell, it's also not the whole story. So it's easy to point at Law School Number One and say, you know, the problem is that you only have 5 students of color in your class of 100 students. Of course, these students are not doing well. And so it's easy to prescribe the remedy for Law School One as well. You should admit more students of color, right? Like you should get more students of color in the door. But this diversity, as the example of Law School Number Two, and I think Law School Number Two is like many schools across the country, or what many schools across the country are starting to be. Law School Number Two is quite diverse, and you know, has many students of color, but is also, I would say, failing its students of color in a meaningful way based on the predicaments of the students of color, their mental health challenges, and their outcomes, their grades, their test scores, and their job outcomes. Moreover, Both law school number 1 and law school number 2 are what I would call identity capitalists. And they are capitalizing on their students of color by generating benefits for themselves, benefits that are not being captured or realized by the students of color. And so this is where capitalism comes into play. So the book is not about literal capitalism, right? We're not talking about Karl Marx. Like, the book is not about literal capitalism. Capitalism is a heuristic or an analogy for explaining the exploitation that takes place with respect to in-group institutions who extract value from outsiders, but don't pass that value or that benefit onto the outsiders themselves. All right, let me get out of this PowerPoint and let me just offer a few takeaways. Should we be concerned? I think that the answer is yes. And I'll give you 4 reasons why to think about and marinate on. First of all, I think that identity capitalism is degrading to members of outgroups. It's treating members of outgroups as products or as commodities. Think about Diallo Shabazz, the student in the University of Wisconsin admissions brochure, whose image I showed you on the first slide. The University of Wisconsin treated him as a commodity that they could, a commodity, or as a person whose image they could use at their will. They could put the image wherever they wanted. They could use it however they wanted to benefit themselves without passing on any of that benefit whatsoever to him, to Diallo Shabazz, the individual person. And so I think that there's something about that that is inherently degrading, and I would say maybe even a little bit dehumanizing. The second reason identity capitalism, in my view, is of concern is that it fosters resentment and that impairs what I would call improved relations between members of in-groups and members of out-groups. So members of out-groups are not oblivious to identity capitalism. And maybe some of you can relate to this. Maybe at some institution, not necessarily this institution, but maybe some institution or some organization at some point, if you're a person of color or an out-group member in some other way, you found yourself being pulled into photos, or you found yourself being asked, or we might say voluntold, to speak at particular events or to be available, let's say for recruitment purposes or something like that, right? And I think that over time this fosters resentment. It's not like out-group members don't know what's going on. And as time goes on, it's possible that members of out-groups may perceive members of in-groups and in-group institutions to be using them for their identity. And that may stand in the way of more meaningful relationships between members of in-groups and members of out-groups. The third concern is that when identity capitalism is taking place, it gives members of in-groups a stake in out-group identity, and that can create certain perverse incentives for members of out-groups. And let me just give an example of what I mean by that. Earlier, I mentioned Donald Trump's administration, in which Donald Trump would frequently hold up non-white members of his administration as evidence that he wasn't racist. And one thing that this did for those non-white members of the administration, now you could certainly say, you know, they got themselves into this situation themselves. Don't cry a tear for Omarosa. And, you know, I think perhaps I would agree to some extent, but let's put that to one side. If you know that that certain benefits you're receiving from the in-group are contingent on you behaving in a way that the in-group likes. So, for example, I think that probably Omarosa knows that the benefits that she received by being part of Donald Trump's White House were contingent on her continuing to support the president verbally, but also on continuing to present herself in a way that was not offensive to members of the in-groups, that was what we might say palatable to the in-group. And that might include grooming herself a certain way, styling her hair a certain way, wearing certain clothes. And those clothes might or might not be the clothes that were her first preference, or the hairstyle that was her first preference. And so when out-group members are receiving benefits from the in-group in a way that is contingent on the in-group continuing to approve of the way they perform their identities, then that can cause a distortion in out-group members' identity in a way that can ultimately be problematic. And I continue to come back to the word or the phrase dehumanizing for members of out-groups. And then finally, my fourth and final concern here, and what I would say maybe my overarching concern with all of this, is that identity capitalism frequently displaces more meaningful and more substantive anti-discrimination reforms. And this goes back to what Kyle said in her comments at the beginning. We need to be sure that diversity goals are not replacing equality goals. So making sure that the photos look nice or the website looks nice, that takes energy and time and resources that could be spent doing something that actually benefits out-group members more directly, perhaps that contributes to feelings of inclusion or feelings of belonging. And so these are things that we need to think about and considerations that we need to weigh in considering whether identity capitalism is creating an environment in which acquiring the socially and economically valuable benefits of out-group member identity becomes the focus at the expense of real institutional efforts at reform. And so let me just make this concrete in terms of the two law schools that we talked about a moment ago, and then I'll conclude for the time being. So think about the two law schools that I described, both of which are failing their non-white students. A school might say, for example, we enrolled 40% of students of color this year. We get to put that on our website. We get to take pictures of those students and put those photos in our brochure. We get to tell our donors, we get to tell our trustees, that is enough. And so that school might say to itself, we're done now. We got the students in the door, and may not then spend enough time thinking about whether those students are succeeding, whether they're getting good grades, whether they're getting adequate mentorship, whether they are passing the bar, whether they have jobs when they graduate. Are they happy, right? Like, and so far as it's possible to be happy during law school, right? But are they enjoying their law school experience at least as much as the other students in the student body? And so the risk with focusing on diversity at the exclusion or to the exclusion of other things is that diversity becomes the whole conversation, as opposed to just a starting point for a broader conversation about equality. So I will go ahead and I think stop there for now, because I would love to, first of all, I'd love to leave a lot of time for discussion and to hear everybody's thoughts and feelings and reactions. And I also want to make space for my co-panelists. So thanks so much to all of you again for being here. And I'll turn it back over to Professor Veriani.
Thank you so much. So part of what I love about your writing and your piece is, and I know I've said that we're going to sort of keep, that this has resonated with me on a couple of different levels, both personal and professional. What I love about this is that it marries them, right? There is a recognition that these things that feel visceral and really hit us emotionally are connected to the substance of the way that our laws and systems work around us. So thank you for that. I especially sort of like the way that you ended your sort of initial talk about how this should really be the beginning of a discussion. And that really is the perfect segue into Professor Porter's piece, which really is a very thoughtful piece. And I know she mentions at the beginning that she had different impressions upon a couple of readings of your manuscript. And I, as my students know, I like to really steep with things. And I think that's exactly what Professor Porter has done, and really has a thoughtful response that will take us to that next step in this discussion beyond diversity. So with that, Professor Porter, as I mentioned, is a professor at the University of Toledo, and I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much. So I'm so happy to be here. I just need to echo The thank you to Kyle and the whole law review board for a very flawless experience from start to finish, both with writing the piece as well as with this event. And thank you to Professor Veriani for moderating it. And of course, thank you to Professor Leong for writing this book. I mean, really just when I read it for the first time, which was, as I say in my response piece, a pre-publication manuscript. And I can remember where I was. I was in a hotel in Las Vegas. This was pre-pandemic at some conference, and I spent hours and hours, reading it and doing a review that the publisher was asking me to do. And I was fascinated and disturbed and had all of these emotions. And because I'm a white person, I'll admit there were times where I felt defensive, right? And then I sat with it a little bit, and then I read the final version, like the published version. And a lot of those things, by the time I sat with it and read it again, I had stopped being defensive, and I think I was able to just take it all in and recognize how right it all is. And so when I was asked to write this response piece, though, I thought, okay, well, what can I add? And I do disability law. That's like my main area. And so I started thinking about, what does identity capitalism mean for disability and for disability diversity? And so I'll make three main points. One, just to say disability diversity isn't quite a thing yet, like very few people are talking about it. So that's point one. Point two is, should it matter? Pros and cons about whether disability diversity should matter. And then finally, how, if we are seeing institutions, employers, or educational institutions engaging in identity capitalism, how does that play out in the disability diversity context? Okay, so we're starting to see a change with this, but we rarely see disability considered as a measure of diversity. So for instance, we're actually going through this right now. If we are hiring for a position, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but sometimes at big universities, your pool has to get approved by people across campus. So either a diversity office or maybe HR has to approve a pool. And so they'll let us know if our pool is racially diverse enough, and if it's diverse between men and women, because we don't get the committee doesn't see that, right? Only the people who are on the other end of it see it. But we would never know whether there are any applicants with disabilities. That's not going to get reported to us. So no one will care if there are 0 applicants with disabilities in the pool, and having 1 or more applicants with disabilities doesn't help the disabilities diversity from the perspective of the diversity office. And so that I've seen this phenomenon happen over and over again, and there've been some recent efforts of people to say, why does it not matter, right? And so that's the big question. Does it matter? Should it matter whether or not an institution has diversity of a diverse group of people with disabilities? And of course, because disability is so variable, we're going to talk about what that means. So many people with disabilities have started to talk about the fact that representation matters. And so, numbers are reported in some way. So for instance, the ABA will report numbers of students or faculty with disabilities at various schools. And if those numbers are really low, and they are, just that's the bottom line there. People with disabilities will feel like they are all alone. Like if they go there, they're not going to feel supported or included. And there's lots of evidence that shows that when you have fewer numbers of people with disabilities, there's more stigma, because it's more obvious that they're different, right? When there's lots of people with disabilities, we stop seeing it as being so different and start, it ends up being less stigmatized. And there really is so much stigma surrounding disability, frankly, especially in law schools. And so we're hearing this, complaint from people, and yet we have such small numbers. But if you look at the definition of disability under the amended Americans with Disabilities Act, which was amended in 2008, over half of the population likely has one or more disabilities. And that's not reflected in anything you see. So if you look at stats, again, from law schools especially, and the legal profession, it's like 1% get reported, 1% of people with disabilities. And we know that's not reality, right? We know that there are a lot more of people with disabilities in law schools. And so why is that? Why are people not reporting? So there's a huge underreporting problem. Some of it's because if their disabilities are invisible, those invisible disabilities are sometimes also the most stigmatized disabilities. So mental illness is still very stigmatized. Learning disabilities sometimes are stigmatized. Maybe HIV, things like that might be stigmatized. So that's one reason. The other reason is that some people with disabilities don't really consider it part of their identity. And so unlike sexual orientation, which is usually also invisible, but people who are gay are more likely to see that as part of their identity and therefore more likely to claim it. But a lot of people with disabilities don't do that. And then I saw in January this really interesting phenomenon. So there's a new AALS section. It's called Law Professors with Disabilities and Their Allies. And we met for the first time in January. And there was this really interesting conversation where people who had disabilities, invisible disabilities, said they want to claim it in a way to make other people feel welcome and included, but that they didn't want to claim it in the reporting context, right? They didn't want their institution to benefit from their disability, partly because they felt uncomfortable that, well, my disability isn't that serious, so I don't want to claim it for reporting purposes, but also because they didn't want their institution to use their disability to avoid hiring other people who have disabilities and perhaps more significant disabilities. And yet the response to that was, well, but if you don't report it, then the people who are looking at that institution and those statistics are going to continue to feel that if they go there, that they're not going to be included, that they're going to feel lonely and isolated. And that is a debate that we didn't solve in that meeting, and I don't know whether we ever will. And yet without reporting, diversity efforts based on disability will fail. Now there's an advantage to that. We won't have identity capitalism if we don't have disability diversity efforts. But the disadvantage is that fewer people with disabilities will get hired, and those who are hired are likely to be stigmatized. Okay, so those are, the pros and cons. I see the cons, but I ultimately want to say that I think disability diversity should matter, because there are lots of people who say that seeing that representation matters to them to feel included. So then in my paper, I explored the question of how identity politics will play out in the context of disability diversity. So in other words, if businesses are engaging in efforts to hire or promote more individuals with disabilities for the optics of it, rather than because it's the right thing to do, what do those optics mean for which individuals with disabilities will benefit and which will not? So if we're promoting our efforts through pictures, which is a big part of how institutions promote their diversity, most identity capitalists will try to hire people with visible disabilities. And the most common one is somebody who uses a wheelchair. And we see lots of examples of this, like in entertainment. So on TV, Artie from Glee, or a new show, relatively new show, Isaac from Sex Education, both of them use wheelchairs. And in this classic identity capitalist example, on a show called Superstores, I don't know if anyone watches that, it's really funny. There's an episode where Garrett, who's a Black man who uses a wheelchair, spends the entire episode trying to avoid the photographers from capitalizing on his identity. He knew that they were trying to find him because they're like, oh, we can take care of two identity groups in one picture, right? Someone who's disabled as well as someone who's Black. And that one just, it's funny because it's a comedy show, but it's also really troubling because it reflects reality. And so although increasing the number of visibly disabled employees is a good thing, it's problematic if the reason for it is because of the optics of it. And it's also problematic if it's done in an effort to avoid hiring people with invisible but more stigmatized disabilities, again, such as mental illness or maybe learning disabilities. But what if an entity is trying to promote based on written statistics rather than pictures? They might hire people with relatively minor disabilities that are not at all, or certainly not very stigmatized. So maybe high blood pressure or asthma or minor knee or back impairments. And so although it's hard to determine which disabilities are more significant, I think it's obvious that prioritizing those with minor impairments to report higher numbers will harm those with more stigmatized or biologically severe disabilities. And so my final point is the one that Professor Leong spends so much time talking about, which is that if identity capitalist employers are focusing on the numbers of disabled individuals, they will not be focusing on the inclusion. And I argue that inclusion is perhaps even more important in the disability context because it often takes more on the part, more effort, time, money, resources, et cetera, on the part of an employer to create an inclusive environment for people with disabilities. So not only do they have to modify the physical accessibility of their buildings, but they also might have to make accommodations to the rules and policies that employers have. So I don't know where I am on time, but just one quick example from a case called Van de Zan. It's a very early ADA accommodation case. And she's an individual who uses a wheelchair, and the company it's a big state agency, was building a new building, and she asked for them to put a sink and a low shelf that she could reach in their break room, because they had break rooms on every floor where people congregate and talk and get their coffee, et cetera. And they refused. And the court, Judge Posner from the Seventh Circuit, said she can't complain about no sink because she can just go to the bathroom to use the sink in there. And so instead of being included with all of her coworkers who are hanging out in the break room and getting coffee and chatting, she now has to leave the break room to rinse out her coffee cup, soup bowl, or whatever, and go into the bathroom, which, I don't think food and bathrooms ever should go together, and is very much being not included. And Judge Posner in the Seventh Circuit just said, oh, that doesn't matter, right? That, she calls that stigmatizing. That's just, that it doesn't matter, basically. And so I do think inclusion here is so important. I think it is possible for institutions to place an emphasis on disability diversity without engaging in identity capitalism, but they have to do it really carefully. They need to be thoughtful and avoid the temptation to capitalize on individuals with visual disabilities. But more importantly, they really need to make sure that their environments are inclusive for people with disabilities. And that often means making really hard decisions about accommodations. And so if we don't do that, I don't think that that disability diversity will benefit people with disabilities if it's not an inclusive environment once they get there. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'll stop there, and I'm excited to hear the rest of our discussion.
Your timing is perfect, so you're making my job easy. That's wonderful. Thank you very much for that. I know I have received a few questions from students here, and some of them I think are going to directly address sort of some of the things that you've said, Professor Porter. So we'll look forward to hearing more from you in the moderated discussion. I can't wait. Next, Professor Farwell has written a really interesting piece, and I think that sort of the thinking about underrepresenting and the importance of measuring these things and sort of the double-edged sword that can be is something that's going to resonate when Professor Farwell talks about her really, really interesting response piece. So I'm going to turn that over to Professor Farwell.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be able to be part of this conversation. I joined New England Law Boston this year after practicing as a transactional and tax attorney at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and at a mid-sized firm in Boston. But where I started reflecting on Professor Leong's book was actually outside of my professional work. I've had the privilege to serve on the boards of organizations that provide legal services and sexual and reproductive health care to underserved communities. And like so many groups, last year, one of these organizations had a board retreat that was focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, because all organizations were focused on that last year. And at this retreat, the question was posed, what would it look like for our board to be an anti-racist board? And the answer that stuck with me and that resonated even louder as I read Professor Leong's book was, it would mean we give up control. And in essence, for this board to live out its stated objective of becoming more anti-racist, we as a group of primarily white, straight, highly educated, wealthy women would need to get out of the way. And to make room for and to cede power to others who were better positioned to lead the organization in that work. And in doing so, I think we would be rejecting the reflex of identity capitalism to hold on to power while professing a commitment to diversity. So that conversation got me started thinking about the diversity or the lack of diversity of leadership of various different organizations, companies, universities, nonprofits, or government, and how a lack of diverse perspectives and lived experiences can contribute to a lack of awareness about how outgroup members are being treated. So sort of going to the two law school example of how people are actually experiencing their participation or their involvement with a group. As I read Professor Leong's book, particularly her discussion of anti-discrimination and affirmative action laws, I was struck, disheartened, sombered, all of those words, with the reality that laws that I envision as protecting outgroup members, in some cases, and arguably were passed for that purpose, in some cases cause additional harm. So that sort of brought me back to the boards of directors and thinking critically about efforts to increase diversity of business leaders and boards of directors. And in some ways, this is the synergy of capitalism as a form of economic structure and capitalism, identity capitalism. Instinctively, my gut tells me that laws and policies that drive towards increasing the diversity of boards of directors are a good thing, right? I think that goes to the sort of, diversity is not a bad thing. But then I think the question is whether laws that require greater diversity on boards actually, by their structure or by their enforcement, encourage or facilitate identity capitalism. And there are two laws in California that were sort of the first of their kind, and I think are sort of the models at this point with respect to public company boards of directors. So SB 826 and AB 979 require that public companies that are headquartered in the state of California include on their boards women and people from underrepresented communities, which, by the way, is defined to mean people of color and members of the LGBT, but no Q or plus community. So each of these laws requires when they were first enacted that boards of public companies have at least one woman and one person from an underrepresented community. And then in the succeeding years that they increase that number up to 3. Depending on the size of the board. So these laws were passed with the stated goals of increasing gender and racial parity and equity, and of improving financial returns for the companies and in turn for the state. I want to acknowledge that we're talking about the directors of public companies, and that we're in this context aiming to increase diversity sort of at the highest echelons of US business. And so in a lot of ways, the people that we're talking about who might join a public company board come to this discussion already in some position of power. They are people, you don't join a public company board unless you are already a pretty powerful person in some context. But that doesn't mean that these people who are now being invited potentially to join public company boards will have equal opportunities or equal voice when they join a board of directors. It doesn't mean they'll have the same experience as other board members. And I think through this discussion, you can hear that there's a real risk that they're subjected to identity capitalism. Even though they are the apparent sort of titans of our capitalist system, they too can be subject to this. With that caveat, the laws are working, or so it appears. When it comes to changing the composition of public company boards. So in the 3 years after SB 826, which focuses on increasing women on boards, was passed, the number of companies headquartered in California without a woman on their board went from 30% to 1%. So that's a huge change, right? Like that's working. It's doing what it's supposed to do. At least it's doing what it's supposed to do optically, right? If you're taking pictures of your board, you've got a better looking picture now. But whether it translates into meaningful change in how corporate boards and then the companies that they're directing actually work and make decisions, it is not as clear. So I think that examining how the structure and enforcement of these laws works and who they actually benefit is really important. I think that we need to think about the unintended, or maybe less obvious, perhaps intended, side effects of these laws that are ostensibly focused on just increasing diversity. One of the most powerful tools within the California laws, which have also been adopted by other states, by the SEC, by NASDAQ, are requirements that companies report on the composition of their boards. And arguably making this information public sort of pulls back the curtain and makes information about board composition more accessible. And this should equip stakeholders, whether they are investors or employees or customers, with better tools to demand meaningful changes in leadership, not just to demand the sort of apparent changes, but to demand real changes. But I think there's, as Professor Veriani alluded to, there's a double-edged sword, because a disclosure requirement can create a false narrative where you can say, hey, look, we're complying with the diversity law. You can check the Secretary of State's website. We got a check mark next to gender diversity. We're done, we're good. And so it gives companies that are meeting the bare requirements, but not making any real efforts to promote or support historically underrepresented groups, it gives them a potential seal of approval of you've done what you needed to do. I think one way to get at this within these laws is to expand the disclosure requirements to not just require that board members' identities be disclosed, but that their positions within the board are disclosed, because the real power comes in chairing committees, chairing the board, or being on particular board committees where major decisions are being made. So I think that there's an opportunity for disclosure to be a more powerful indicator of substantive change. The final risk, I'm sure there are more, but the final risk that I'll highlight in laws like the 2 California laws is that boards will meet the required composition requirements, but will resist steps to actually increase the influence or power of these newly appointed board members. There's a real risk that a singular woman director or a singular director of color will be marginalized or isolated. And there's good evidence that you need 3 people in a group, depending on the size, but you generally need 3 people to sort of fight that potential isolation. And on public company boards, that's hard because they are often much smaller than that. They are very often small groups. So if you only have to add 2 women, you may not get to that 3 number. And it's clear in the legislative history that the California legislature was trying to prevent this by creating that step up. If your board is larger, then you need to add more diverse board members. But the law contemplates, explicitly says, you can increase the size of your board so that you can comply with this. So you don't have to get rid of your old board members. You can keep them around and just increase the size of the board, which again adds the risk of dilution of those new board members. I think here the thing that the legislature in California and elsewhere can do is to watch how companies are responding and to make sure that those minimum numbers continue to be meaningful to allow for meaningful participation of diverse board members on boards of directors. I'll wrap up by saying clearly the law is not the only tool that we need to impact how corporate boards work, right? There's lots that happens behind the scenes that the law is probably ill-equipped to address. But to the extent that laws like the California laws I've talked about invite identity capitalism, we need to be conscious and proactive in reducing or paying attention to those potential harms. So I'm so grateful for Professor Leong's work in this area and helping us to see the way that identity capitalism permeates our society and what we can do about it. So thank you very much.
I really miss the ability to hear applause on Zoom. I do feel like there should have been some applause after each of these presentations. They're happening internally for me. So I have, as I said, received some questions before from various students, and for me, they've fallen into a few different categories. And I'm going to try to separate them into categories. So if you don't hear your question verbatim, please know that I have read them and really try to thoughtfully organize them into different groups. So for me, the 3 different groups they fall into are sort of, one I call the sort of gray area group, where there's something that is a little bit unclear about what, how do we think about diversity, or how do we think about some of these concepts that have to do with pulling apart the gray area and trying to figure it out. The second area has to do with application to the real world. People have looked around and seen things in the real world, and they want to think about how these concepts of identity capitalism apply. And the third is by far the biggest category, and it's sort of, I think of as this, so what do we do category, which I think has started, each of you has started to address some of each of those in your presentations. But I'm going to start with the sort of gray area, and I want to ask Professor Leong to really, so we've been talking about identity capitalism, and you have used the word dehumanizing a couple of times, and it is the one that has really resonated with me. And as a property professor, as many of you know, and as some of you are, thinking about sort of that taking something of value from someone and making it your own, that sort of conversion is something that happens in these concepts of identity capitalism. I wonder, Professor Leong, if you could talk a little bit about the concept of identity entrepreneurship and how that relates to identity capitalism, because I think it informs some of the gray area questions that I've received from here. So could you talk a little bit about that? And know that I'll ask you about how it applies to the real world right afterwards.
Sure, I'd love to. So perhaps I could back up a little bit. For those of you who have never written a book, a lot of the time, a book that is at least in part intended for a general audience, which this one is, will be based on prior scholarly research. So in 2013, I published an article called Racial Capitalism, which described the concept of identity capitalism, particularly in relation to race. And then 3 years later, in 2016, I published an article called Identity Entrepreneurs, which I viewed as the other half of the racial capitalism piece. And so an identity entrepreneur is a member of an outgroup who leverages their identity to acquire some kind of benefit for themselves from the in-group. So it's an outgroup member who's using their identity to get some kind of value for themselves from the in-group. And so I give a number of different examples in the book. And I want to be clear from the outset that I think that identity entrepreneurship is a pretty complicated phenomenon. I don't think that identity entrepreneurs are inherently good or inherently bad. But a simple act of identity entrepreneurship, and I'm trying to make a lot of my examples relate to the law school context today, but a simple act of identity entrepreneurship might be something like writing a personal statement in a law school application about your membership in an outgroup category that you know is of interest to the law school. So if you are a member, if you're a person of color and you wrote about your experiences growing up as a member of a community of color, or your experiences growing up as a person of color in a predominantly white community or something like that, that would be a small act of identity entrepreneurship. And what you're doing in this situation, perhaps, is making your outgroup identity membership salient or noticeable to the in-group, specifically the law school admissions committee, in a way that you hope will benefit you at the margin. So maybe tip your application from the maybe pile to the yes pile, or maybe from the no pile to the maybe pile, right? So that would be an example of a small group of, or a small example of identity entrepreneurship. Professor Veriani, I don't want to talk and talk, so maybe I don't know if you want to
Yeah, so
ask a follow-up.
Yeah, I think, so one of the things that I know that I've been speaking to a lot of students about, and I didn't get exactly the question this way, but it seems to me that one of the things that's going on in our world around us right now is that we have the Senate considering the nomination of a new Supreme Court justice who was nominated. Before she was nominated, the president said, I want to nominate a Black woman to the United States Supreme Court, right? Which for me is related a little bit to sort of the way that we consider identity as something of value. And I take nothing away from the clearly sterling credentials of Justice Brown Jackson, but there are some layered things that happen here, particularly as we consider that there is an affirmative action case that is related to sort of the very small example of identity entrepreneurship that's going to be coming before the Supreme Court soon, that has a lot of layers of identity capitalism and entrepreneurship here. So I just I don't know whether I don't know which of the panelists, I know that you don't want to speak a lot, but I'm so interested in your thoughts, but also I wonder if any of you, but especially Professor Porter, I know that we have just mentioned the affirmative action context and sort of what's happening with our Supreme Court right now, but I wonder if Professor Porter, you can think about the way that we leverage sort of that kind of identity. I know that you've spoken about it a little bit, the layers of that, in particular, the way that the in-groups and out-groups relate. I know that there are sometimes that in-groups will be identity entrepreneurs too. I'm thinking very specifically of our, again, I can't get our affirmative action case out of our head, and there's an engineer of that. So if there's anyone who wants to save me from messing this question up so much more than I already have, I wonder if there's someone who wants to talk a little bit about the layers of what's going on in the world around us and how in-groups and out-groups and identity and value and that can work together.
So maybe I could throw out a few ideas and then
Yes.
throw it off and then pass it on to the other panelists. So with respect to the affirmative action case, I have two observations. The first is, imagine that it's 1978. And suppose that Bakke versus Regents of the University of California was decided based not on the diversity rationale, but instead on either a remedial rationale or some kind of distributive justice rationale, meaning remedial meaning making up for past wrongs, distributive justice meaning, let's level the playing field a little bit. Like some people have a little bit too much of an advantage over other people. So imagine that the Supreme Court had gone with either of those two rationales, which were proposed and rejected. We would be having, I think, a very different conversation about affirmative action right now, because one of the questions we would be asking is, well, if the rationale for race-conscious college and university admissions is remedial, making up for past wrongs that have been inflicted on members of out groups, then the question I think we'd be asking is, have we done enough to level the playing field? As opposed to the diversity rationale, which causes us to think about things like, well, let's count the number of people who are here. And of course, there's much more to diversity than that. And I don't want to be trivializing, but I just at the outset, as Professor Veriani is suggesting that we pick apart the layers of what's going on with the affirmative action case, I just want us to think about how different the conversation would be right now if this case had been decided on a different rationale. And it wasn't, right? So there's a way in which this might be a little bit of an academic exercise or a question that's more interesting to academics, but I think that we would be talking about very different things. So that's the first observation. The second observation is, I think that in the context of the affirmative action case, the Students for Fair Admissions, SFFA, versus Harvard case that is at the Supreme Court right now. Notice how there is a premium on outgroup identity being placed on outgroup identity by opponents of affirmative action. So when Edward Bloom, he's the guy who's essentially bankrolling the lawsuit against Harvard, was seeking plaintiffs to challenge Harvard's race-conscious admissions program, as well as the race-conscious admissions programs at some other schools. He specifically sought out plaintiffs who were Asian American, not plaintiffs who are white, but plaintiffs who are Asian American. And I think part of that is optics, because if we have a white student, maybe even a relatively mediocre white student like Abigail Fisher, the optics of that are not good. It looks like this relatively mediocre white, I'm speaking very candidly, this relatively mediocre white woman, Abigail Fisher, complaining because she didn't get into her top choice school, which was the University of Texas. This is the 2015 affirmative action case, right?
Which I might also add was orchestrated by Edward Bloom.
Which was orchestrated by Edward Bloom. That case didn't come out the way he wanted, and so in the case that's going on right now, he's sought a very different kind of plaintiff, specifically Asian American plaintiffs who have, I think, what could be described as very outstanding credentials from at least a numerical, like a grades and test scores perspective, right? So there is a premium being placed on outgroup identity, and I think that we could call the outgroup members who are participating in this lawsuit, to some degree, we could call them identity entrepreneurs, right? Like they're leveraging their outgroup identity for a benefit to themselves, which is the opportunity to be involved in this litigation and potentially to effectuate a change to this policy that they don't like.
And it strikes me the way that he's relying on, or he's sought plaintiffs from the Asian American community takes into account some of the collective biases that we have, and sort of contributes to that dehumanization that is central to sort of the identity capitalism concepts. And that's particularly interesting given the holistic admissions policies that we've been, that some of the schools use in that. I'm also well, I'm going to move away from talking about affirmative action just for the moment. I think we might come back to it, but I also sort of want to, I have a lot of questions about media representation of out groups, really, and how that, what can we do about that? How can out groups trust media representation? What can we do to change representation? And I know that Professor Leong had posted the Harvard Business Review piece about the three women, but I know that there's been some other work about sort of when representation is sufficient that we can see diversity in our diversity, that we can see humanity in the people and not just them as a representative of their out group. So do any of you have any thoughts about sort of how we can change the way that we represent people, not just in sort of the counting the metrics about diversity that each of you has mentioned, but in sort of the way that we portray our leaders and our people who take these positions that are visible in order to change the conversation a little bit?
One thing that I thought about actually in listening to Professor Farwell talk is that perhaps we need better metrics than just how many. So I'm no expert on corporate boards, and so maybe Professor Farwell could educate me a little bit about what exactly the metrics might be. But it sounds to me like it's not just is the person on the board, but what position do they occupy on the board? And so if there are a way to make these more meaningful or more substantive metrics more visible or more salient to the population, and to help the population like me, who doesn't know anything about corporate boards, understand a little bit what metrics I should be looking at, as opposed to just the raw numbers of members of outgroups on the board, I think that could be one thing that's helpful. Professor Farwell, do you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. I think that getting beyond the numbers to the positions. I mean, in the same way that if you think about the faculty of a law school, you can count people, but if you're counting all of your adjunct faculty, you may have a very different faculty than if you are describing your full-time staff. You can look at the numbers really differently when you look at what positions people are in, for sure. And on public company boards, we're generally talking about groups of 10 to 12 people. So we're talking about very small groups of people, but what role they play and how long they stay on the board can have a real influence on their influence on the corporation. One thing, if I can kind of go in a little bit of a different direction, Professor Veriani, when you asked about media portrayals, one commercial that comes to mind, or I don't think it was ever on TV, there was this Oreo video about in the last year or so, advertising Oreos, but with this person coming home to their family and bringing their same-sex partner home with them for the first time. And there's this whole short about like the trial of coming home with someone who your family might not accept. And then at the end of it, the dad is outside painting the fence with rainbow colors. And I loved the video and I loved it so much. I showed it to my kids, but I didn't wonder what the parent company of Oreo is doing behind that. And so I think in some ways the media portrayal really should be an impetus to us to ask, well, what's behind that? That was lovely. I loved it. I was inspired. But what are you doing about that what are you doing for your staff? Or what are you doing for out in the world? So just a media portrayal thought.
Or are you just happy to have a bunch of other people now loyal to Oreo cookies?
Right. Yeah.
So to go back again to the substance, Professor Farwell, you were mentioning sort of the going beyond sort of the metrics and thinking about that. As we have talked about that framework of Law School 1 and Law School 2, I'm gonna ask this question, and I'm gonna ask. I see that there are a lot of people who are in attendance, and so if you want to hear a voice that is not mine or one of the panelists, I encourage you to raise your hand or send me a note in the chat if you want to ask a question yourself of these panelists, and I will help you to do that. But to go back to the sort of framework of Law School 1 and Law School 2, in Professor Leong's example, Law School 2 that has succeeded sort of on these diversity metric fronts, as I think about how Professor Farwell has structured her piece and thinking about different things that we might use to measure. I know I have a lot of really wonderful in-group colleagues who do a lot of good substantive work in their classrooms to talk about things like race or systemic racism or think about critical theory. And so it strikes me that that is sort of the next step, right? That is, we're not going to capture that in metrics about diversity. And yet the good work being done by people in groups feels like something worth measuring or encouraging or assigning value to. So it feels like that is sort of one of the things that we can consider how to incent or encourage as we consider these concepts. Thoughts on that from anyone? Professor Porter, unmuted.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask Professor Leong a question about the second law school example. And my question when you were talking about that, and I read it in your response essay, was what role, if any, does critical mass play? So when I was thinking about why are the students in school number 2 unhappy, that was the question, right? Like, so there might be other things going on about there's not being enough academic support, et cetera. But with respect to the depression and unhappiness, just sort of like the common thing you hear, and maybe this is not at all true, is that the critical mass helps, right? It helps people to feel like they belong. And this is what's so hard about disability, because you almost never get to that if no one's disclosing, right? You never get to a critical mass with respect to disability in really any company or any institution. So why does that not help those students feel like they belong? Because there is a critical mass of them at institution number 2.
So I think it absolutely does. And I think all the sociological research, and you touched on some of this in your discussion of disability specifically, all of the research on stigma and on belonging, the things that make people feel comfortable and thriving in a community, critical mass, I think, helps with all of it. As a side note, critical mass was a rationale that the Supreme Court discussed with some skepticism in the 2003 affirmative action cases that came out of the University of Michigan. So I think that my point with respect to the law school example is that critical mass alone may or may not do it, depending on what else is going on at the law school. So just to give an example, if the professors at the law school are by and large not a very culturally sensitive group, so if there is a lot of insensitive or outdated or even offensive language being used in classrooms, or if there are a lot of microaggressions in the classroom, or if there's not a lot of sensitivity to the way that events that are going on in the world might be impacting members of different communities differently. Things like that. Like if there's not a lot of sensitivity in the law school to the way that members of racial outgroups or any other outgroup really might be experiencing the environment differently, then I think that critical mass could help, but it's not going to be enough because of all of the other factors that are contributing to a differential there between members of the in-group and members of the out-group. The other thing that I wanted to say is that I think that we actually do see some of this in the legal academy, because I think in most law schools, the student body is more diverse than the faculty. Not every school, but I think that's certainly true at most schools. And so in terms of having role models or having mentors available who relate to the student body in some way that is meaningful to individuals who are members of outgroups, there might be a short supply of professors who are able to bridge that divide through personal experience. So, I think all of this is not at all to disparage critical mass, which I think is really important. I do think that it's one in kind of a constellation of factors that might be playing into the well-being of outgroup members overall.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Professor Porter, that actually reminds me of a question that I thought of while I was listening to you talk. And I'm not sure if this is an empirical question or more of a theoretical question. So I'll just try to ask it, and then I'm interested in hearing what you have to say, which is, you were talking about how representation matters in terms of stigma, right? And so if somebody is the only one, then there would be more stigma than if they're one of a few, or one of several, or one of a critical mass. I was interested in your thoughts on the extent to which stigma reduction applies across different kinds of disabilities. So, for example, does the presence of someone, does the presence of someone, let's say in a wheelchair, help destigmatize someone with anxiety or somebody with ADHD? So that's the first part of my question. And then something else that I've been thinking a lot is about intra-group diversity with respect to race. So does the presence of, for example, Ketanji Brown Jackson help destigmatize the legal profession for members of other racial groups, Asian Americans, for example? So maybe we could talk first about disability and then whether it translates to other identity categories.
Yeah, so a disability, I think, because disability is, I think it's more varied than even like a lot of other identity groups. It doesn't always translate, right? So if you are a person with a severe mental illness and you're looking at an institution, the fact that there might be a couple of people who have mobility disabilities is probably not going to make you feel like it's going, that there's going to be less stigma there. I mean, it might a little bit if it shows that the employer is willing to make accommodations, but it depends on what the disability is. So for instance, for a job that is just a desk job, for instance, nothing that's like physically rigorous, someone who uses a wheelchair but has complete fine motor skills control, they're not really going to need to be accommodated much at all, as long as the building itself is accessible, which these days, this many years after the ADA was passed, most big buildings are pretty accessible. And so you're not really going to have to provide many accommodations to that person. Whereas somebody who has even like chronic pain illnesses like rheumatoid arthritis or things like that, fibromyalgia, there's several of those, they might actually need more onerous accommodations, right? Because they might need occasional time off, they might need leaves of absence, et cetera. And so I don't know how much it signals to someone, let's say with either mental illness or a chronic pain disease, oh, that's a company, just because they see people with physical disabilities, people who use wheelchairs, for instance, oh, that's a company that's going to be welcoming. I mean, it might say that a little bit, just because in some companies you'll find nobody, right, who's disabled. So it might be better than the company not having anyone with any disabilities, but I don't know that it necessarily signals to that person, hey, this is going to be a welcoming place for someone with my particular disability, because everyone needs different accommodations. And that really is so context dependent on the type of job. So it's a physically rigorous job, now the person who uses a wheelchair is going to have a harder time and need to be accommodated much differently than someone with a mental illness, for instance. And so I think especially with the really stigmatizing disabilities, someone who has a physical disability is not probably going to be enough for them to feel like, oh, this is going to be a welcoming place for me. And so like the intra-class discrimination question is this with disability is incredibly complicated, in part because no courts are talking about it yet. And I keep waiting because now that the definition of disability has been expanded, there really should be more of these cases. So an employer has to decide between giving a vacant position to someone with kidney failure, right? Who's on kidney dialysis and needs that vacant position to accommodate their kidney dialysis schedule, or do they give it to the person who has a very serious back impairment and can't continue standing, for the entire shift, and this new job or this vacant job is a sitting position. And those are really hard questions, right? So which one matters, right? Which disability deserves to have the protection or the preference of getting a coveted position? And we don't have answers to those questions. I've tried to pose them in some of my work, but so far the courts aren't talking about it. And it's all like, on what metrics do we define disadvantage with disability is really complicated. Is it stigma? Is it pain? Is it like biological severity? Is it the ability to go out and get another job if you get fired from this one? Those are questions that we don't have answers to, and I think are going to have to get answered in the future when we start seeing more people with disabilities asking for similar accommodations.
Your 2018 sort of work on cumulative hardship, I think, is directly addressing this, and is for those of you interested in hearing and reading more in depth about that, it's a really wonderful wonderful piece. I have a couple of students who I know have questions, and I'd love to just hear a voice that's not mine, and if I could call on them. I'm gonna look to Emily Horges first. Emily, go ahead.
Hi. I guess I just was kind of wondering how these ideas of identity capitalism and entrepreneurship connect to the idea of somebody being treated as a token, in particular with diversity and equity inclusion, where a lot of people that were members of, I guess, outgroups, if they were the only member of the outgroup at an institution, would automatically be kind of included in that, and kind of how that, your thoughts about that, and I guess what implications it has.
I suspect that the written question I got before the law review came from Emily, because I know her, and she said, I think this is yours. Most large law firms have diversity committees. The Venn diagram of firms with committees and firms that have achieved meaningful diversity is almost two circles. And so I think this is similar to what Emily is asking here, but I thought that was a nice articulation of that same question.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific articulation, and such an important framing. I mean, I think that tokenism relates to identity capitalism in the sense that they are both superficial and concerned with appearances rather than with any kind of substance, particularly with substantive equality. So tokenism meaning, we're not a racist company. Look, we have a Black employee over there, to caricature it a little bit, right? And so I think that would be an example both of tokenism and of identity capitalism. Something that I think animates both tokenism and identity capitalism is this idea of trying to get credit, like with being preoccupied, whether it's an institution or a person, being preoccupied with trying to get credit for not being racist, or for having satisfied a particular diversity objective, or to go to Professor Farwell's work with having complied with the 2 statutes in California, right? So the idea here is that the institution is trying to get credit, or to prove that it did what it was supposed to do, without actually following through on the spirit of why they were trying to diversify the environment in the first place. And so I think that these ideas of tokenism and identity capitalism, I think they come from the same place. And I think would potentially, I don't know if people would be interested in turning the conversation to solutions. Maybe we could go there next, but I think that they might require some of the same solutions.
Yeah, I would like to go to solutions, but I'm going to add just one more wrinkle before we get there. I have a question about transgender rights and self-identification in out groups. So this question says, recently there's been a push for transgender rights, especially with regard to the movement characterized by a desire for societal acceptance of self-identification. For some, self-identification, specifically with regard to gender, is unacceptable as it goes against the previously undisputed reality that human beings are created either male or female. For others, self-identification is a celebration of an increasingly accepting world in which allies in every corner of society are standing in support and solidarity with the transgender community. So I want to just sort of add this wrinkle of, you know, when these different kinds of identities are invisible, right? Or, you know, fluid. How does that sort of, how do we deal with that? And let's think about that as we sort of move to the last sort of, well, what do we do? The solutions part of the discussion.
Well, I think that, maybe I'll start. So
Yes.
I think that identity capitalism and whether it's transgender identity or really any other category of identity, fluid or not, identity capitalism is a phenomenon that looks at any identity category that has some kind of social value. And it could be transgender identity. It could be working class identity. It could really be almost any identity category, fluid or otherwise. And the question that an identity capitalist would ask is, how can I use this person's outgroup identity membership to benefit myself or my group or my organization or my institution? And so in that sense, I think there's something about identity capitalism that is universal and that cuts across many, many different identity categories. I mean, I think that Professor Porter has very compellingly translated it to disability, maybe more so with respect to diverse disabilities that are visible. But you could also imagine an organization saying on its website how inclusive it is with respect to people with mental health issues or something like that, right? And that could be viewed as identity capitalism as well. So I think that identity capitalism is something that is relatively malleable as new identities emerge or start to receive more attention or become socially prominent in some way. Maybe to turn the conversation to solutions, in my book, one solution that I talk about a lot is honesty, specifically just naming the phenomenon and talking in a way that is potentially uncomfortable about what is going on and why it's going on. And I tell a few painful stories from my own experience in this situation in an effort to encourage readers maybe to grapple with some of the more uncomfortable examples from their own past as well. But so I'll just, as a general matter, say that I think that honesty is a building block for all the rest of it, because you know, if an institution can't explain why it wants to, for example, have more women on its board, or why it wants to have a racially diverse student body, then it's very difficult to make progress. And I think that part of that also involves acknowledging that the institution may have some room to grow. So, you know, every law school right now advertises itself with promotional materials that feature a lot of faces of color. I mean, I think that some law schools would be well served by saying something along the lines of, look, we have progress to make in the area of racial diversity or gender diversity or whatever form of diversity it might be. But we're heavily invested in doing this. We're offering scholarships. We've established a dean of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, whatever the measures might be. But so being more honest about what the problem is, like what the starting point is, and then what concrete substantive measures are being used to address the problem. I think that would be a better and more productive starting point than, look at all the photographs on our website, which is where I think some institutions are right now.
Considerably more difficult, I might add, which is why your work in this book has resonated so deeply with me. And so we had started talking about the way that this sort of has such a personal resonance. And for me, this is a really nice place to come to as we start concluding, right? Because the things that resonate so personally are exactly the things.
Oh, I think Professor Porter might have something to say. And I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sorry.
I think Professor Porter, I know Professor Porter has to teach on the hour.
Oh, you're right. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, I just, Professor Leong, when you were saying that, I had that exact conversation with a student of color in our school who's also on our diversity committee, who came to talk to me about, your book and your ideas. And he was saying why, like, everyone just needs to be more transparent. Like, instead of pretending like everything is great by here's these pictures, because, we're one of those schools that has a lot of room to grow. And I think the committee's doing what they need to do. They're not just considering, diversity. They're considering, how do we make these students feel supported? How do we make them feel included? How do we make this a more welcoming environment for everyone? But that idea of, you have to say, and I love the example you gave in your book of just like a company who comes out and says, like, we have a lot of room to grow. Like, we're not in a great place. We're not where we want to be, but here are the steps. That's not exactly what you say, but like, here are the steps that we are trying to take. And everyone's so afraid to do that, right? Like, it's this idea, it's almost like the idea of like, apology is a bad thing. You never want to apologize or admit, you know what I mean? That you admit that you could be doing anything different or better. But I'm a really big believer in, sort of apologies and transparency, like admitting that this isn't great and we need to improve it. And here's the things that we're doing, rather than look at how diverse we are in these pictures that are hopefully never photoshopped anymore, although maybe that's still happening, but not representative, right? And so it was just a conversation we just had. And I thought, yes, exactly. We just have to start being much more transparent about it. And I think people are afraid to do that, but I actually think it would really, if we could change the narrative to being more honest about this, I think it might move the ball forward. Maybe.
Yes. I'm sorry for not seeing you trying to.
Oh, no, that's okay.
But yeah, that's exactly the value of works like this one, right? Is that they do precisely move the ball forward. So I know that we have to get to Professor Lustig. I see Rochelle's hand, and I know I have had a number of students tell me that they have questions, but I do want to save time for Professor Lustig. Before I turn this over to the Center for Business Law, I want to say one more thank you to each of these panelists, but also to give Professor Leong, if you'd like it, a chance to sort of think about closing. I think this is a really nice thinking about sort of the ways that we can be honest and vulnerable, even about our flaws, being a really good next step. In particular, because we don't know exactly where that will lead, that can be difficult. But I think it's a really nice, it's sort of a beautiful place to think about beginning the next phase. So I wanted to give you the chance to conclude before turning it over to Professor Lustig.
Oh, well, I just wanted to thank everyone again for this wonderful conversation. I've really learned a lot today, and I want to invite all of you, especially the students who are in attendance today, feel free to reach out over email. I'm very easy to find on the internet. And the law review also has all my contact information. But if you have stories of identity capitalism, or of things that have happened to you, or things that you're thinking about, please do feel free to reach out. One of the things that has been so interesting as I've talked about this book to different audiences is that almost everybody, I would say, has a memory of a time that they've kind of acted like an identity capitalism, or maybe a time when they've been kind of an identity entrepreneur, right? In ways large and small. And so I think to conclude, I would just encourage everybody perhaps to take the framework of identity capitalists and identity entrepreneurs into the world. And the next time you're looking at a website or maybe in a conversation with your school's admissions office or whatever the situation might be, to think about how these principles or these concepts might inform the conversation that you're having. So thank you again. And I'm really excited to hear what Professor Lustig has to say.
Great. Thank you, Professor Leong. Professor Lustig, I know that you want to say some things on behalf of the Center for Business Law, which co-sponsored this event.
Wow. That's the first thing I want to say. Wow. So thank you so much. This was really terrific. Thanks to Professor Leong for the wonderful book. Thanks to Kyle Sutton and the Law Review for asking us to partner with them. And thanks to Professor Variani for doing a great job to moderate, and the panelists, Professor Porter and Professor Farwell. Those were all terrific points. I guess as I sort of share Professor Porter's discomfort in being a member of the in-group, probably more so. And, you know, it's a challenging and interesting book that certainly puts me in some, you know, uncomfortable positions. I think that's probably a good thing. On a lighter note, I picked up, and I think it's probably because I'm just too old, I picked up the great term voluntold. I hadn't heard that before. And that's great. I had no idea who Diamond and Silk were. I looked them up and I still don't really know, but I think I don't care, which is
Sounds
okay
like you
too.
have some Googling to do tonight.
Yeah, I Googled
a little
them.
time on Urban Dictionary.
Yeah, no, yeah, last time I was in Urban Dictionary, I was looking up whether or not vomitaceous was a word or not. It turns out it is. So I had some thoughts from a corporate side. So one of the points that Professor Farwell raised, which was great, is, you know, there's one thing to disclose what's going on, and then the next to try to figure out exactly what's going on. And I was thinking about, you know, in terms of contemporary things, I was thinking about the I think self-inflicted wound that Disney has put itself in the last, you know, 10 days in kind of, and for those, I know I see some of my BizOrg students there, and we've been talking about this for a while, but, you know, they kind of came off soft on a position with respect to the Florida law. Then they realized, well, that's not what we mean. And then they came out hard, and then they kind of got cornered. And I think it may be a sort of a tale for what happens when companies say that they are that they're diverse, and maybe they're not. And I actually then took a look at Disney's board. Professor Farwell suggested, we were talking about this a little, he said, what's the composition of the board? And I thought, you know, I actually haven't looked at it in a while. So I took a quick look. I'm not sure I was completely accurate, but just looking at them quickly, it looks like 4 in group, 3 out group, just based on appearances. But that really begs the question, I think, that Professor Leong was asking Professor Farwell. Do the numbers mean anything? I mean, maybe 3 is enough to say something, but then you've got to go and look at the dynamic of how those boards operate, because the numbers may not tell that story. And part of it is, and this is something we're talking about in class right now, how do directors become directors? I mean, they don't go pull papers at town hall. They are put in by the in-group, the incumbent management, which is likely to be much less diverse than what they're trying to do. And they remain in office basically at the pleasure of incumbent management. So, you know, those are additional things, I think, to think about with respect to at least how corporate directors work. And then I was also thinking about one other thing, and this was Professor Leong said that part of sort of, I think she had 4 points. where to the extent that the in-group benefits from the out-group, and look for those kinds of scenarios by using the out-groups by being identity capitalist. And I was thinking, is that really the converse of the idea of externalities, where corporations are already sort of, through the idea of externalities, they're taking their problems and pushing them out. And that's just particularly about corporate liability, environmental damage, things like that. Is that point really the converse of externalities? I don't know, but I thought that was sort of what I was thinking about during this. And I don't really have much more to say other than a couple of things I was thinking about, because the conversation was just great. And so I look forward to reading the responses. And then I also want to thank, in addition to all the students who showed up, which is a really, really great turnout, and my colleagues were there. So a lot of our colleagues, and I want to encourage people on our faculty to write a short response piece or reflection piece to put online, along with one I will certainly write, and keep this conversation going. So with that said, thank you so much, and thanks for inviting us.
Great. And thanks to the Center for Business Law. Yeah, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation at Symposium, but it's really my hope that everybody keeps having this conversation in much smaller and larger and more personal and more formal groups, in every group that you are a part of. So thank you very much. Kyle, I am going to say my final thank you to each of the panelists for your work and for your attention to these issues and for your presence and discussion today. And I will turn it over to Kyle, who I will also thank one more time for your execution of this event and your thoughtful presentation, and let you sign off.
Thank you again. This has blown all of my expectations out of the water, and I just couldn't be more grateful to have had such an amazing turnout. I want to let everyone know that Lucas Tabaros won the raffle book, so we'll be reaching out to you later. I'm so excited to share this book with you. But the Law Review and I and the Center for Business Law just want to close out this discussion with a huge thank you to Professor Veriani, Professor Porter, Professor Farwell, Professor Lustig, and an even bigger thank you to Professor Leong for sharing with us your thoughts, experience, and for allowing your work to be the cornerstone of this important discussion. And a big thank you to the Law Review and the Center for Business Law members for all the hard work that you put in to making this symposium and the corresponding Law Review volume possible. I won't keep anyone because I know a lot of us have classes at 6, but I thank you all again, and I hope everyone has a great evening and a great night.